Peter Sutcliffe, the real man with one of the most famous aliases in the history of serial killers, the Yorkshire Ripper. And in recent times we received a 7-part miniseries that explored the hunt for his capture and the results of his terrible actions. I'm going to discuss this show now, meaning there will be spoilers ahead. Please consider checking the link below to our second channel, The Horror Exchange, but for now, this is why The Long Shadow is nightmare fuel. This series is similar to the recent Jimmy Savile drama The Reckoning in the sense that it was based on extensive research but made some slight changes to names and added some scenes for the purposes of dramatization. With The Long Shadow, the main source material was Michael Bilton's 2003 book Wicked Beyond Belief, and it utilizes an all-star cast including the likes of Toby Jones, David Morrissey, Lee Ingleby and Daniel Mays. However, unlike The Reckoning, the focus isn't on the culprit. Here, the Ripper is kept just like his killing career, in the shadows, hidden from view, and it's his reputation and the results of his nefarious crimes that are felt through the victims and police as the focus. I find that this gave The Long Shadow a scarier mood throughout, as not only are you unsure when the Ripper is going to strike next, but we witness the vast emotional and physical damage done to the victims, their families, their friends, and the investigating forces. What we see is an entire world of pain and loss, the ripple effects of many torturous years evading capture. This series is definitely more of a show about those affected than about the Ripper directly, and as such, it packs a much larger punch. The waves begin in a gruesome fashion with the establishment of a core theme of the series, financial difficulty. This was Britain in the 1970s, and because of the struggles of the time, many women resulted into becoming prostitutes as a means of making easy money just to scrape by. The very idea of feeling like there is no alternative way out other than to sell your body to feed the kids or get through Christmas, it's horrendous to contemplate. I can only imagine how women viewed this series, but even with a male perspective, it was still upsetting and uncomfortable to watch what these women would have to endure at the hands of men. As such, though the Ripper is the worst case scenario of the kind of man these women encountered while on the game, there are plenty of other vile men in this series that add so much more nightmare fuel to the experience. Even acknowledging that this is a series about the Ripper, there are multiple other sources of fear and intimidation felt here. The world itself is an awful place to reside, and it resulted in a plentiful exposure to terror. The first taste we receive of Sutcliffe's actions comes from the murder of Wilma McCann, mother of 4 kids, via lacerations to the head and 15 stab wounds. This isn't just a killing, it's a butchering, and this is the theme to the Ripper's murders. He goes after prostitutes because they're easy targets. They can be lured into a vehicle and driven out into an open space because that's the nature of the game. Then he can dispose of them in a mundane fashion with tools and savage their corpses for a sick sense of pleasure. But also, from the very first kill here, the Ripper doesn't have any consideration for those who are left behind. 4 children experiencing the death of their mother at a remarkably young age, old enough to comprehend the loss, and this severely impacted the eldest daughter, Sonia, who wound up taking her own life in 2007, over a quarter of a century after the Ripper was apprehended. The Long Shadow grits its teeth and presents the raw reality of just how many people were deeply troubled by the Ripper. In his 5-year killing spree between 1975 and 1980, Sutcliffe murdered 13 women, with further confirmed and suspected injuries. His profile here, the scale of his operation across West Yorkshire and Manchester, led to one of the most expensive manhunts in recorded British history. You could imagine the pressure and strain on the investigative side of the equation trying to crack the case, and The Long Shadow even demonstrates that for us. Toby Jones plays Dennis Hoban, who is eaten away at by the case. Even when he receives a promotion, he clings onto the Ripper, and he passed away before the Ripper was caught. He spent the latter years of his life possessed by the gulf of torment brought by the Ripper, and it consumed him. But it even goes as far as psychologically breaking down the other men at the top of the totem pole. George Oldfield, Jim Hobson, Dick Holland, Ronald Gregory, John Nunn, all officers who became swept up in the cloud of chaos. chewed up and spat out, and had their credibilities irreparably damaged. It's a tumultuous journey for them along the way, as the Ripper becomes such a big deal, but that, in a horrific sense, aids them. When the string of murders enlarges, there's more interest from the press. The grieving families of victims have journalists turn up on their doorsteps, wanting to prod them for information when they are in a trough of bleakness. The police have to increase their efforts on what they want the press to publish, having to walk on eggshells because the wrong decision could impact the following response by the Ripper. It's a series of mind games that these men endured, having to walk into work every day knowing that the Ripper was tough to trace, and the only way to make things easier would be to wait until he killed again, to potentially provide more leads to go on. It's a gut-punching catch-22. We need to get him as soon as possible to prevent any further murders, but for us to do that, we need him to kill again. As it happens, the police search and eventual capture doesn't wind up being an easy feat. It's got to a point where the officers in charge were seen as being negligent for not investigating thoroughly enough, for going down the wrong paths. Their jobs were burdens that they were held accountable for, and with every fresh victim, their reputations crumbled further. Even the reputations of regular officers were dragged through the coals, including one young female officer who was drafted in to pose as a prostitute in a series of undercover missions. Just because she was young and pretty meant that the men in charge saw value in her and believed that she could be utilised as bait. Putting this woman in her mid-20s in the firing line of a known killer as a means of attack? It's not only a harrowing sign of the times, which highlights the gender divide at play all the brighter, but equally it shows the desperation of the police. They were willing to potentially sacrifice a pawn in order to checkmate the king, but rather than chess pieces being involved, it's people. This took advantage of a young pretty girl on the books and put her reputation in jeopardy, and it frightened her beyond belief. Another example of reputation having a severe impact on people is in relation to prostitution. It's such a stigma that people can be dragged down by association to it. Women who have been attacked by the Ripper but survived, including Marcella Claxton and Maureen Long, are labelled as prostitutes despite not being. This is due to the police's reports that the Ripper specifically targets prostitutes. Some of the Long Shadow's most heartbreaking subplots come in relation to Marcella and Maureen to me. Firstly, with Maureen, she has memory loss from her attack but is taken out by police officer Meg Winterburn to try and jog any recollections. However, Maureen breaks down, feeling that all eyes are on her because of how she is now viewed. She says that she is now marked, scarred forever, all because of the assumed link between the Ripper and prostitutes. Not only does she have to live with the memory of the attack, she has to live with the stigma, and that damage will last for the rest of her life. What a truly soul-crushing consideration. Then, in the case of Marcella, she was pregnant and actually lost her baby as a result of the attack, which is a whole other world of hurt to endure to begin with. But she is then labelled as a prostitute by the police to a point where she is denied any compensation from the attack. By the way, I must say the realisation of the scene where Marcella called the police for help was outstanding. It was done via Ruth Madeley taking her phone call, and the entire scene is only her responses to Marcella trying to keep her calm. Your mind imagines what's happening on the other end of the call and fills in the blanks of dialogue. It was brilliantly handled. But back to Marcella, this woman has been financially disabled and lost her unborn child as the result of the Ripper's twisted games. Her outcome is to be stigmatised and punished. What a despicable turn of events for a very normal woman, all down to the narrative of the evidence distributed by the police. The Long Shadow really does draw a sharp line on how women were belittled by society at the time. As previously described, they were targets for vile men, targets for murder. They were used as cannon fodder. Their truths were not heard. Sometimes they had false truths forced upon them, and they had to fend for themselves, putting themselves in danger, all because of economical factors. When the first murder is revealed, the forces are quite blasé about it, saying that McCann was killed because she was a prostitute. And even later, Oldfield is one of the top men in charge of the case, yet he openly says people care more about the donkeys in Blackpool than dead prostitutes. In all honesty, this likely assisted Sutcliffe in staying under the radar for so long, because his victims were people who a wider male-dominated dominating society didn't have an awful lot of care or respect for, leading to investigations perhaps not having as much fuel or desire behind them. Things do take a strange turn when a man from Sunderland puts himself in the open claiming to be the Ripper himself, but this wound up being another wild goose chase that put the police on the wrong path, while the real Ripper was still at large. Another sick individual who wanted to play games, totally separate to the real case. In the end, after all the ruthless killings, all the hearts broken, all the lives shattered, Sutcliffe was finally arrested as the suspected Ripper. It's very shocking because, as Dennis suggests earlier in the series, he's a really ordinary bloke. He's well spoken and comes across as pleasant. He's a man you could pass in the street and not look at twice. He's unassuming. You'd never believe he committed the heinous acts that he did. And yet, the most shocking part of his capture to me is the revelation that he had gone through the system multiple times before, including being arrested in 1969 for carrying a hammer, 6 years before the known Ripper cases started. They had him. Before the 13 Ripper murders, they had him in their grasp, and they let him go. They swept him under the carpet and allowed him to freely kill. What's scarier still is, were there more victims between 69 and 75? And if so, how many? We will probably never know, but regardless, it's chilling to know they had Sutcliffe years in advance and he slipped through their fingers before he realised his full potential. The Long Shadow is an incredible example of ITV event television, and the nightmare fuel here is strong. It shows you very little Sutcliffe and very little visual horror. There's no blood and guts here, but there never needed to be. The way people react, those around the dead, the descriptions of injuries, the distress in people at all points of the case, from those in charge to those in the Ripper's sights, all of it resonates powerfully. It makes you realise that even the most normal looking man can have the devil inside him and an entire history of death trailing behind. It makes you consider the hardships of all the women who endangered themselves for money in difficult times, and those who lost their reputations or their lives as a result. It makes you think about the children and loved ones left behind, and how they became associated with the Ripper, with fatal consequences. And most of all, it is a stark reminder of one of the deadliest serial killers to ever walk the earth. These are the reasons why, to me, The Long Shadow is nightmare fuel. I'm Connor from Unleash the Ghouls. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and if you are currently or have been affected by themes discussed in this video, then please seek help or advice from anyone you are able to. Cheers.